When I met Daniel, I was 21 and still carrying the emotional scars of growing up in a house where love always came with conditions. My mother could turn a compliment into an insult before you even realized what happened. One moment, she'd tell me I looked pretty, and the next, she'd point out everything wrong with me: my weight, my hair, my clothes, my laugh. By the time I became an adult, I had learned to accept criticism as affection. So when Daniel came into my life like a tornado of attention and charm, I thought I'd finally found safety. He was 24, confident, successful, and magnetic in a way that made every room bend toward him. He opened doors for me, bought flowers just because, and texted me every morning before I woke up. He told me I was different from every woman he'd ever known. He said I was the only person who truly understood him. Looking back now, I realized he studied people the same way predators study prey. At the time, though, it felt like destiny. Within a year, we were married. Everybody said we looked perfect together. He was ambitious and polished. I was quiet and eager to please. He liked telling people I saved him. I liked feeling needed. The first few years were mostly good, or at least good enough that I ignored the warning signs. Daniel always had little comments about my appearance. "You'd be stunning if you lost 10 pounds. That dress would look better on someone taller. You should wear makeup more often." He'd say these things with a grin, like he was joking, and if I looked hurt, he'd laugh and accuse me of being sensitive. Then came the competition. If I succeeded at something, he found a way to make it smaller. If I got attention, he redirected it back to himself. If I had an opinion that disagreed with his, he'd argue until I was too exhausted to continue. At first, I thought that was just marriage. Every couple fights, right? But over time, something changed in me. About 5 years into our marriage, I started therapy. At first, Daniel hated the idea. He claimed therapists brainwashed weak people. But I was struggling with anxiety and depression, and for the first time in my life, I wanted more than survival. I wanted peace. Therapy changed everything. Slowly, I started rebuilding myself. I joined a competitive sports club filled with strong, encouraging women who celebrated each other instead of tearing each other down. I went back to college, even though nobody in my family had ever graduated before. I worked late nights, survived on caffeine and stress, and somehow kept pushing. For the first time in my life, I felt proud of myself. Daniel hated it. Not openly at first. He was smarter than that. Instead, he became colder. He stopped celebrating my accomplishments. If I talked about school, he'd stare at his phone. If I mentioned my training, he'd suddenly need to leave the room. Compliments disappeared completely. Then the passive-aggressive comments started. "Must be nice having free time for hobbies. I guess college matters more than your marriage now. You've changed." That last one became his favorite weapon. And maybe he was right. I had changed. I was no longer the insecure girl who apologized for existing. One day, after weeks of tension, I convinced Daniel to attend therapy with me. He resisted hard, but eventually agreed after I framed it as something that would help me communicate better. He loved anything that sounded like he was the victim. The sessions were exhausting. Every conversation somehow became my fault. If I brought up feeling lonely, Daniel would explain why I caused it. If I mentioned his criticism, he'd accuse me of being unstable or dramatic. Sometimes he'd smile calmly while I cried, which somehow hurt worse than yelling. After our 5th session, my therapist asked to speak with me alone. I remember sitting in that tiny office with my hands clenched in my lap while she carefully chose her words. "She obviously can't diagnose someone officially without evaluation," she said gently, "but I believe your husband shows strong narcissistic personality traits." I stared at her. Back then, I barely understood what that meant. She explained manipulation, lack of empathy, control, superiority, emotional punishment, and the cycle of idealization followed by devaluation. It felt like someone secretly recorded my marriage and turned it into a textbook. Still, she never told me to leave him. In fact, she emphasized that some relationships involving narcissistic traits can function if both partners are willing to work honestly. But Daniel wasn't interested in honesty. He was interested in control, and the more confident I became, the tighter he tried to hold on. Around that same time, his work trips became more frequent. Long weekends turned into week-long conferences. Late-night meetings became normal. He guarded his phone more carefully than ever before, carrying it everywhere like it contained nuclear codes. At night, I'd wake up and see the glow of his screen lighting the darkness, while he smiled at messages he'd quickly hide if I stirred. Deep down, I already knew, but knowing and admitting are two different things. One night, while he was in the shower, I finally broke the unspoken rule of our marriage. I opened his laptop. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type his password. The moment his email loaded, my entire world collapsed. Women. So many women. Emails, hotel confirmations, photos, explicit messages stretching back years. Some relationships lasted months, others were one-night stands during business trips. There were coworkers, random women from bars, even a woman barely older than some of my college classmates. 10 years together, and apparently I'd spent most of them sharing my husband with strangers. I sat there numb while the shower water ran in the background. The terrifying part wasn't even the cheating, it was realizing how easily he'd lied to my face every single day. That was the moment the illusion died. And once you truly see someone like Daniel for what they are, you can never unsee it again. After discovering the affairs, I stopped sleeping normally. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside me like nothing had happened. Sometimes he'd roll over and wrap an arm around my waist, and I'd have to fight the urge to physically recoil. The same hands touching me had touched countless other women, and somehow he still expected affection, loyalty, admiration, everything. What scared me most wasn't the cheating, it was the realization that I no longer knew the man lying next to me. Once you recognize manipulation for what it is, your entire reality starts rearranging itself. Conversations replay differently in your mind. Arguments suddenly make sense. The guilt you carried for years no longer feels like yours. I started noticing every tiny thing, how he only complimented me when he wanted something, how every story somehow revolved around him being smarter, more successful, more victimized, or more important than everyone else, how he enjoyed making people feel small. At work, he bragged openly about manipulating coworkers to get promotions or leverage. I used to laugh nervously when he told those stories because I assumed he was exaggerating. Now I understood he wasn't joking at all. And for the first time in our relationship, I became afraid of him. Not because he had physically hurt me before, he hadn't, but because I could feel the shift happening between us. Narcissists thrive on control, and once they sense they're losing it, things can become dangerous, emotionally, psychologically, sometimes physically. He could tell something inside me had changed. I became quieter, more observant, less reactive. Instead of arguing, I listened. Instead of defending myself, I let him talk. And weirdly, that seemed to bother him more than fighting ever had. He'd pick at me constantly, trying to trigger a reaction. "You've been acting weird lately. You're getting cold. You think you're too good for me now because of college?" Every question felt like bait. I answered carefully because by then I understood something critical. If I confronted him directly about the cheating and demanded a divorce, he would make my life hell. People like Daniel don't leave relationships peacefully when they're losing power. They need to win. They need control of the narrative. So instead of exposing him, I manipulated the manipulator. Even now, years later, parts of that time feel blurry from stress and survival instinct. But I remember deciding one thing very clearly. He had to believe divorce was his idea. That was the only safe exit. So I slowly changed the dynamic between us.
I stopped begging for affection, stopped chasing him emotionally, stopped trying to fix the marriage. When he criticized me, I didn't argue. When he withdrew emotionally, I let him. And because narcissists feed on emotional reactions, my calmness drove him insane. At the same time, I quietly started preparing my escape. I saved whatever little money I could from my minimum wage job while finishing my final semester of college. I researched apartments. I talked discreetly with trusted friends. I kept important documents hidden where he wouldn't think to look. Meanwhile, Daniel's ego kept expanding. He started acting more openly arrogant, almost like he wanted me to notice his affairs without actually having to admit them. He stayed out later, smiled at his phone constantly, started dressing younger. Then came the new girl, 24 years old. Daniel was 37 by then and absolutely thriving off the attention. I remember seeing her picture online for the first time and just feeling tired. She looked young, trendy, overly confident in the way people are when they think they're special for being chosen by someone toxic. I didn't hate her at first. Honestly, I mostly pitied her, because I knew exactly what version of himself he was showing her. The charming version, the attentive version, the soulmate illusion. Eventually, after months of subtle maneuvering, Daniel finally brought up separation himself during an argument. I can still remember forcing myself not to look relieved. Instead, I acted heartbroken and hesitant. I let him think he was the one taking control. He framed it like he was unhappy, like he had outgrown the marriage, like he deserved more freedom. And I nodded as carefully as I could, because all that mattered was getting out safely. Once divorce papers were filed, though, the mask slipped almost immediately. Cruelty replaced subtlety. The man who once claimed he adored me suddenly treated me like an inconvenience taking up space in his life. And somehow the new girlfriend got even worse. At that point, I was 3 weeks away from graduating college. I barely had money. My job paid almost nothing. Daniel made 6 figures, but I was so emotionally exhausted and desperate for freedom that I didn't even pursue alimony. To this day, I regret that, but back then, survival mattered more than fairness. I found a terrible last-minute roommate situation because it was all I could afford quickly. The place was cramped, loud, and depressing, but at least it wasn't emotionally dangerous. The final move-out day felt like walking through hell. I rented a U-Haul and spent hours carrying boxes out of the small rental house Daniel and I had shared for years. The entire time, he and his new girlfriend lounged around the house like spectators at a sporting event. She played with my dog while I struggled carrying furniture. She kept accidentally stepping into my path while I hauled heavy boxes. Both of them made little comments just loud enough for me to hear. Nothing outright explosive, just constant humiliation, mocking laughs, whispers, smirks. Daniel at least tried to pretend he wasn't being cruel. The girlfriend didn't even bother hiding it. At one point, I nearly dropped a heavy box after she stepped directly in front of me, and instead of apologizing, she laughed. Laughed. I remember looking around that house thinking about everything I had sacrificed there. 10 years of loyalty, 10 years of emotional labor, 10 years of shrinking myself to keep a man comfortable. And now I was being treated like entertainment. The worst part was leaving my pets behind temporarily while I figured out stable housing. My dog looked confused every time I carried another box outside, and I had to keep excusing myself to cry privately in the bathroom. Meanwhile, Daniel acted completely unbothered, like our entire marriage had been a minor inconvenience he'd finally upgraded from. But beneath my heartbreak, something else was growing. Anger. Not explosive anger, cold anger, the kind that waits patiently. And as I drove away from that house for what I thought would be the last time, I realized something. I still had my key.
For a few weeks after moving out, I tried convincing myself to let everything go. I really did. I focused on finishing college. I worked my miserable minimum wage job. I tried adjusting to life with a roommate who left dirty dishes everywhere and blasted television at 2 in the morning. Every day felt like survival mode. But no matter how hard I tried to move forward, the images kept replaying in my head. Daniel smirking while I carried boxes alone, that girl laughing when I almost tripped, the absolute disrespect after 10 years together. And the thing about emotional abuse is that people rarely understand how deep it cuts unless they've lived through it. Bruises heal. Broken trust settles into your nervous system and stays there. Even after escaping, part of you still feels trapped. I kept remembering all the times I'd defended him, all the excuses I'd made, all the moments I ignored my instincts because I wanted love so badly. Meanwhile, Daniel was already publicly acting like he'd won the divorce before it was even finalized. Mutual friends started quietly telling me things. Apparently, he'd been spinning the story hard, claiming I was emotionally unstable, claiming I changed after therapy, claiming college made me arrogant. According to him, he was the exhausted husband who simply couldn't handle me anymore. Classic narcissist behavior. Rewrite history, protect the ego, destroy the other person's credibility before they can tell the truth. The crazy part? Some people believed him. That hurt almost as much as the cheating. But then, one afternoon, while sitting in my tiny rented room eating instant noodles for the 3rd night in a row, I remembered something important. I still had keys to the rental house, and because the divorce wasn't finalized yet, technically I still had every right to enter it. Now, before I continue, let me make one thing crystal clear. I never wanted to hurt anybody, especially not animals. My pets were my entire world. I would have walked through fire for them. The house itself, though, that place was already disgusting. The landlords were slumlords who ignored serious maintenance issues for years. There was black mold growing around parts of the laundry room and bathroom ventilation. The flooring creaked like it was rotting underneath us. Half the vents barely worked properly. So one day, fueled by heartbreak, exhaustion, and probably way too much caffeine, I came up with an idea so petty and ridiculous that even now I can't believe I actually followed through with it. I drove to Petco. The employee working there looked completely unbothered when I asked for feeder crickets. Apparently, people bought them constantly for reptiles and exotic pets. I bought 4 large bags. 4! As the cashier rang them up, the crickets chirped loudly inside the paper bags like tiny demons cheering me on. Then I stopped at a grocery store and bought buttermilk. The whole drive over to the old house, I kept thinking, you are either a genius or completely insane. Probably both. I waited until I knew Daniel and his girlfriend were at work. Their schedules had become painfully predictable during the divorce process. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the house already smelled faintly damp from the mold problem. The silence felt eerie, like walking through the remains of my old life. Some of my memories still clung to that place. The tiny kitchen where we danced while making dinner during happier years, the living room where we watched movies together before everything turned toxic, the bedroom where I spent countless nights questioning my own sanity. For a moment, I almost lost my nerve. Then I remembered that girl laughing at me while playing with my dog, and suddenly my determination returned. The house had an old ventilation system with floor vents that connected underneath the structure before circulating air upward through the rooms. Absolute nightmare design. Perfect for revenge. One by one, I lifted the vent covers and dumped crickets in. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds altogether. The sound was horrifying, a chaotic storm of chirping and scratching disappearing beneath the floors. I actually started laughing halfway through because the entire situation felt so absurd. Here I was, a soon-to-be college graduate in my 30s, crouched over moldy air vents, unleashing insect warfare on my cheating ex-husband. Life is weird.
After the cricket operation was complete, I moved on to phase 2. I poured buttermilk into a spray bottle and lightly misted sections of the walls, especially near warmer areas of the house where the smell would develop faster. Now, if you've never smelled spoiled buttermilk combined with dead insects and moldy ventilation, count yourself blessed, because under the right conditions, that combination creates an odor so foul it feels almost supernatural, like something died inside the walls, which technically, eventually, many crickets did. I didn't drench the place or destroy property permanently. Honestly, the existing mold was already doing most of the heavy lifting. I just gave the process a disgusting little boost. Then I left, locked the door behind me, and drove away feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since discovering the cheating, I smiled genuinely. A few weeks later, I got confirmation it worked. One of our mutual acquaintances mentioned running into Daniel while he was furious about a horrible smell in the rental house. Apparently, maintenance workers couldn't immediately figure out where it was coming from because it seemed to move through different rooms depending on airflow. His girlfriend allegedly refused to stay there for several nights because the odor became unbearable. When I heard that, I laughed hard, I cried. Not because it fixed anything, not because revenge healed me, but because for once, Daniel had lost control of the situation. For once, he couldn't charm, manipulate, or intimidate his way out of discomfort. He just had to sit in the consequences of a rotten environment, something I'd been doing emotionally for over a decade. Years later, I don't necessarily recommend revenge. Healing would have happened eventually without it, but I also refuse to pretend I regret it completely. That prank wasn't really about crickets or spoiled milk. It was about reclaiming power after years of being made to feel small. And honestly, every time I remember that moldy house filled with the smell of death and chirping insects, a tiny part of me still thinks, worth it.